I think this is really, really powerful advice that as a CEO, push it as hard as you can and see what comes back the other way. You might be surprised.
A really important fake rule is that you can't say bad things about philanthropy if you work inside philanthropy. And I think that kind of conversation, that kind of debate is really important if you ever want to get better.
But if you can't speak out about authoritarianism or attacks on the very communities that you're purporting to protect, if not now, when?
Welcome to another exciting edition of our little show, Break Fake Rules. And today I'm with my good friend, Eric Brown, our co-host extraordinaire for this episode. Eric, thank you for being here this time.
Extraordinaire.
That's right. You are that person. You are the extraordinaire.
Okay. That sounds kind of French, but that's all right.
You know, is that normally an issue? If all of a sudden something sounds French, is that a problem?
I don't know. It's, people are afraid of the French, but that's okay. I mean, we love the French. We love the French.
Who are these people? Why are they afraid of the French? What happened?
Hey, you know who else we love right now, Glen?
Right. Who's that?
Our guest today, Gara LaMarche, is one of the most interesting people in philanthropy, if you ask me.
Wow. And do you keep a list?
I keep a list. You're climbing on the list.
Oh, wow. Yes, I fell back, I understand, a few steps, but I'm coming back.
You're on the upswing. No. You're climbing. But Gara is near the top of the list.
Wow, I see him up there. I see him way up there at the summit.
So, and for a couple of reasons, and one, of course, that I'm sure you will very much appreciate.
Yes.
One is that he worked with George Soros at Open Society Institute, and that it worked hard on advancing social justice, and became a flashpoint for critics.
Yeah.
Because, in my perception, because of how effective they were. And then the other thing, he worked for Chuck Feeney at Atlantic Philanthropies, which is probably our most famous spend down foundation to date. And so he has a perspective on philanthropy that I think is really valuable. He understands and knows everybody who has existed in philanthropy, and he has become a critiquer, let's just say. Someone who's pushing back against the norms. Dare I say it, Glenn, he is one of the original fake rule breakers. What do you think?
Yeah, he is. There's no doubt about it. That's why I wanted to have him on. We felt very, very fortunate that he had time to join us. What's one of the fake rules you've seen him break that comes to mind for you? Do you have one in there?
Ooh. Well, I mean, certainly the ability to push back against philanthropy, in my mind, to make it better. Somebody inside the ivory tower, the hallowed halls of philanthropy, tends to not try and push back against its own institution. And I think that kind of conversation, that kind of debate is really important if you ever want to get better. And so I think that's maybe a really important fake rule is that you can't say bad things about philanthropy if you work inside philanthropy.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And it's not like bad things, but you can't push it to be better.
I can tell you from my own experience that we do have very thin skin in this sector, and you have to be really careful about with some people about how you talk about the work, how different foundations are showing up. And, Gara is a really creative guy. I mean, he literally, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this later, but he literally did this trial where he was the prosecutor and had really powerful results. But what I think is really interesting about why he felt compelled to do this is worth learning about. I'm sure he will get into why he was so compelled to really put philanthropy on trial. And it's a really powerful reason. And he will, I'm sure when he talks about it, he will be very modest and humble about it. But I encourage all of us listening to this episode to listen closely to his reasoning. I almost want you to pause if he gets there and stop the recording and listen to what he's saying, because I think it is one of the most powerful questions we face in the sector. I'm just going to leave that teaser right there. What do you think of that?
I'm so excited. But
yeah.
we've had this conversation before, Glenn. It feels to me like philanthropy is at an existential moment.
Yes, I know you feel that. I know you feel that.
The question is, how do you make it so that philanthropy actually does the things that it is designed to do?
Right.
That it takes advantage, full advantage of the resources that are available to it. Many, many billions, if not trillions of which are currently not doing anything. They are not being used to support the types of work that foundations say that they want to do. And so therefore, like, there's this huge opportunity, and at the same time, there's a great big challenge of, if not now, when. And I think that Gara, the work that he has done, and frankly, the energy with which he continues to apply himself to social justice, to change, suggests to me that there is a place for philanthropy. But given what we are seeing these days, you have to ask the question, well, why aren't we doing more?
Yeah, and I think there are real challenges to that. You know, I think what we've seen in the last year, where government checks have been cut down and cut out for services, there's been this question, is there a role for philanthropy to fill the gap? And obviously, maybe it's not obvious, you have to know the numbers to know this, but we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, and the foundation sector currently, if we were to put it all into one bank account, is somewhere between 1.6 and $2 trillion in held assets. Assets, for the most part, that are invested in hedge funds and other things that are not easy to quickly liquidate and get out and put into the world.
Even though you did it.
We did do it, and I will say it took months to get that money back. So you do have to kind of have yourself in position to move, meaning you got to liquidate and have it ready. But the part about that is just, is it the role of philanthropy to fill the service question? Or is it the role of philanthropy to move into more of an advocacy and policy position and push for change that prevents things like governments that have, in my opinion, a responsibility to deliver these services from being able to just vacate that role? Should we be building up social litigation in favor of protecting these social goods? Should we be building up the sector so that it's funding itself in a way that leads to greater collaboration and coordination? And these are the questions that are coming up. And then, of course, there's voice. Like, is there a role for the sector to use its voice? All of this is stuff that Gara talks about and thinks about all the time. And we've certainly been tested on every single one of those fronts over the last year, which is pretty both fascinating, frustrating, and at times exciting.
Yeah, well, I've always thought, or at least I've been thinking lately, that when there is no fallback, that philanthropy also will have to step in to deal with the things that government should have done. So when the levees break and people are in need, you gotta buy rafts to get folks, to safety, and then you got to go back and rebuild levees, and then you also have to work on climate change so that we don't have these epic storms that cause the levees to be under stress in the first place. So, like, philanthropy may have to do things that it ought not to do right now, while it is still dealing with the underlying causes of many of the challenges that our society faces.
Right. And it may require that you're doing more giving
right
in the next couple of years than your board is normally comfortable doing.
And the other thing is, it is important to be able to make space for people to be able to protest, to whatever, speak truth to power.
Yeah.
And this is where foundations, and certainly the people they support, but foundations have a voice. They have the opportunity to speak out with a relative degree of impunity. I've always, said that foundations, one of the reasons they're not as good at communications as they need to be is because they truly don't have any enemies in nature. And so, they can't run fast. And what are the other things that cause the saber-toothed tiger to eat them? They just don't have any enemies in nature. The worst thing that can happen is
there's no adrenaline response. There's just no adrenaline response.
Exactly. So, and although they perceive that the enemies are great, they perceive that someone's going to take away their tax status, for example.
That's right. Freeze their assets.
It happened to a famous foundation formerly managed by a president of the United States. Other than that,
state of New York, if I'm right, took that action.
Exactly. But so if you think about what happened in Minneapolis,
Yeah.
it emboldened people, or it reminded them that using your voice matters, and that being able to speak out and stand up and be counted actually does matter, even in the face of real problems of overuse of military and overuse of police and things like that. So it matters, and the more people speak up, it allows more other people to speak up. And I'm saying, this is just how democracy works, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And we are now seeing foundations and nonprofits feel like they actually can speak out, and that it will make a difference, and that we all have to kind of get together to just say the truth.
Yes, we're coming up on a very big election. Again, they all seem to be big elections, and it'll be interesting as we get closer to it and messages, your communications guy. I imagine you will be paying close attention to what, and I know you've schooled me on this before, communications is not messaging alone. But it will be interesting to see what messages really resonate as we get into this election. And, not to make it a political show, but what I will say I'm paying really close attention to as we get closer in, because this does, how a party wins power or how a party loses power has a big, sets an agenda. It can set an agenda for the road ahead. So I'm really curious to see, if the Democratic Party is able to take over some version of Congress, either one house, two houses, will they get there because they said we're not the president, or will they get there because they stand on an agenda? I think is going to be really telling for the rest of the way, right? Because if they're standing on an agenda, and by agenda I mean one that has a set of policies potentially associated with it, with a target constituency they want to support. If they come forward with that agenda, then that speaks to what we might see over the next couple of years, and it speaks to where philanthropy might lean in. If they come forward with another agenda, which is about we're not him, I fear we end up in another one of these investigation impeachment cycles, which I don't think is going to be particularly productive for the country.
Well, it's an agenda. It may well be a policy agenda, but it is also an understanding and an ethos about how you talk to people and how you understand who they are and what, people need to feel heard. Getting back to what foundations can do is they really need to listen. They need to listen about what people need, about what their lives are like, about how those lives, where the challenges are, and the role that they can play to address that. And then getting back to our guest, Gara, I think he has been particularly good at that in the various steps along his career. I think his foundations and the work that he has done has been about listening to what people really need and trying to deliver on that. And that's where philanthropy can really be powerful.
Yeah, that's well said. I know you have thought a lot about Gara coming on the show, and you want to bring him on. So why don't you introduce Gara LaMarche to our audience today?
I would be delighted. In 2011, the Council on Foundations did something crazy. They invited one of philanthropy's most prominent insiders to put the entire sector on trial in front of 2,000 foundation staff and trustees. The charge? Philanthropy is failing its mission of advancing the public good. The prosecutor was our guest today, Gara LaMarche. He argued that philanthropy is a privilege, not a right, and that the sector has spent decades eroding its own moral authority through self-interest and failing to advocate for the poor while quietly protecting its own tax advantages. The defense argued back that philanthropy helped establish public libraries and Sesame Street, among other public goods. When the jury came back, 10 of 12 voted to convict their own profession. Gara LaMarche knows what philanthropy is capable of. He helped George Soros build the Open Society Institute into the leading funder of criminal justice reform. He ran Atlantic Philanthropies, a spend-down foundation, by the way, which was instrumental in advancing ideas that became part of Obamacare. He ran the Democracy Alliance, a network of wealthy donors organized to build progressive political power. And somewhere along the way, he became one of the most persistent critics of exactly what he was doing, asking out loud why progressives who rage about big money in politics seem perfectly comfortable with big money in philanthropy. This feels like a question worth exploring, because if philanthropic power and political power have become the same thing, and Gara would know, then the fake rule isn't just about who controls the grant. It's about who controls the democracy. Now, let's break some fake rules with Gara LaMarche. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Gara, this is an enormous privilege for us to have you here. And I want to go back, if I can, to something Eric pointed out from your famous prosecution back in 2011. Philanthropy is a privilege, not a right. What does this mean? I thought everybody had a right to philanthropy.
I guess people have a right to give their money away, but when you have the job as you have, and some of us have been privileged to have, of helping to steer philanthropic resources, it's a public trust. I mean, it's my critique of philanthropy, of course, is that I don't like the system which creates philanthropy, the privatization of wealth and the shifting of funds from what might be public goods to private goods. What got me going in the period of time during which I was invited to do this prosecution at the Council on Foundations, was we were working a lot to try to get Obamacare over the transom. And one of the ways in which Obama and his team were thinking of paying for a significant expansion of the social safety net was to, change the charitable deduction a bit, back to where it was in the Reagan period. And big philanthropy, all of my colleagues and the trade associations around philanthropies, the Council on Foundations, the independent sector, and so on, almost with one voice, were resisting that. And I found that it really crystallized the issues for me, because it showed me that when you had a choice between funding a public good that would be a democratically held public good that would make people's lives better and insure people who hadn't been insured, and you could do that by tweaking the charitable deduction a bit, that might result in less money for philanthropy privately directed. Philanthropy wanted to opt for the privatization of that money, not for the public good with that money. And that seemed to me to be a profoundly misguided set of priorities. I've sometimes described myself as a professional redistributionist. I've been given the opportunity to help steer many billions of dollars of rich people's money mostly to power building and bottom-up kind of activities. And while I don't like the system that creates such wealth, and I think the society's priorities are screwed up, if I have the opportunity to help redirect those resources, I want to do it in a way that gets it into the hands of people and communities who are fighting for change.
You and I, Gara, have talked about the role of CEOs and executive directors in the foundation space a few times now. And this dynamic you're talking about of donors drawn to service or product delivery and the metrics that come with that, number of people served. I think that's, for whatever reason, for a lot of donors, that's very fulfilling to see that. And CEOs often, in my experience, I know I'm wildly generalizing here. This is not a rule, but you tend to see these trends of CEOs that are more interested in systems change, that come perhaps with experience either in political science, politics, other forms of behavioral sciences, that come into the sector and really want to do more systems work. So what do you say for CEOs that are in that position where they're having to kind of work with a donor who may not see results the same way they do? Do they have agency here?
They can have agency. I mean, I was talking with someone yesterday, an old colleague who was considering going back into philanthropy, and he had some opportunities to work with a living donor. And he asked me about what that was like and what I learned from those relationships. And, I have worked directly for two of the most generous, large living donors. And what I draw from that experience is that you need to be on the same wavelength as that person. And, I had that kind of relationship with George Soros. So George Soros, I have enormous regard for. He's a visionary person.
Yeah.
When we decided to respond to the Clinton welfare bill in 1996 that cut legal immigrants off from social safety net benefits, George came to us one day and said, this is a great thing potentially about working for a living donor. I'd like to do something about this because I'm really offended by it. He had been an immigrant to England, and the National Health Service had taken care of him back when he was not a rich man. And it just just thought him as wrong. So he said, I'd like to spend $50 million on this, which was not even in our budget. He just kind of pulled it out of our pocket, right? And we created this program called the Emma Lazarus Fund, after the poet whose words adorn the Statue of Liberty. And we spent $50 million over 3 years or so. And he wanted a lot of it to go to services, naturalization, legal services. But also, we spent maybe 20% of it on advocacy. And that advocacy over that period of time resulted in the restoration of the $16 billion in public funds for social safety net for legal immigrants. Pretty good return on investment, I think, right? So his policy was important, but he also liked to see the tangible results of service in the mix. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that the challenge, I think, about advocacy and power building is that for many people, it's difficult to see the returns in the same way. So you can see the kid with the scholarship, you can see the patient served at a clinic in rural South Africa, and maybe you don't see as much the result of investing in organizing groups in Arizona and North Carolina in the same way. But you have to develop the language for it and the habits, and a lot of this has been done over the years to show what the yield is over time. Because my view is that the investment in people and movements is a more enduring investment.
So, this is an interesting point you bring up, because right now, most money that is being pushed towards advocacy is actually political money. And it's now, of course, legal to spend billions of dollars on political ads and other things like that. And it would seem as though investments in nonprofit advocacy are like a drop in the bucket relative to the amount of political money that's being spent. Is there even a pathway for advocacy funding that can deal with the phenomenal amount of political money that's in the system right now?
Yeah, I don't know. I should say something to be clear about the stories I told before. Most foundations have a much greater capacity to support certain kinds of advocacy in the public policy realm than they do. A lot of them are skittish about it, and in the current reign of terror in which we live in the United States, many foundations are even more skittish about it for understandable reasons, because there's a target on their backs. So there's always been a problem getting foundations even to exercise the scope that they have legally as tax-exempt institutions. And most foundations have quite an allergy to that. And also, many general counsel and foundations are extremely conservative people. I don't mean politically conservative in a right-left sense, but they view their job as to wear a belt and suspenders and a raincoat and galoshes and all of that. And I happen to have been fortunate enough, both at Open Society and at Atlantic, to have general counsel who saw it as their job to stay within the law, but to help us do what we wanted to do. They didn't see their job as telling us no to everything we wanted to do. And there should be more general counsels like that and fewer who are overprotecting their foundations.
Hear, hear.
I'd always ask these lawyers, like, are you giving me a legal opinion or a policy opinion? Because a lot of times when you really press them, it's not the legal opinion you're getting.
Right. And interestingly, I talk about this in my book, Control. Those same characters end up on boards too, which I refer to as the consiglieres. They kind of play this role of protecting the donor from risk of, as they see it, risk of the grants that they make. And they can get in the way in many ways of some really dynamic philanthropy by doing that. Go ahead, Gary.
I think a lot of CEOs, there's no doubt that many boards of foundations are drawn from an insufficiently diverse pool of people, right? My boards at both Atlantic and Open Society were, with very few exceptions, because they were the boards that the donors wanted, disproportionately male, disproportionately white, disproportionately establishment, university presidents, things like that. But in both of those organizations, I was able, not just me, but our team was able to kind of lead those boards in a very different direction of grant making that was about social justice grant making, about all the stuff that we're talking about. So I have the experience of having been able to persuade and work hard at it, but to persuade establishment boards to take some very daring moves. Now, I don't say that because I think that I'm the most persuasive person in the world or I found the secret sauce. I do think that many foundation leaders rely on their boards as a kind of a crutch. They don't really push their boards enough or do the hard work. They assume the board will not want to go where they want to go. So this is a little bit against the conventional wisdom about diversification of boards. Of course, I believe boards should have all kinds of people on it, and they should be racially diverse and economically diverse, and I believe in that. But I also know that in the real world, a lot of boards aren't like that. That's not an excuse not to be bold, because I know from firsthand experience that you can do bold things with an establishment board. And I think people, I over the years, when I was at Atlantic and Open Society, and I had really good relationships and still do with a lot of other foundation presidents, but I can't tell you how many people privately said to me, I really admire what you're doing. I wish I could do that, but my board this and that. And I'm like, try them, because, the worst you can do is get fired.
Yeah, and I'm all too familiar with those kinds of conversations, Gara, and I really appreciate that encouragement. I think this is really, really powerful advice. That as a CEO, push it as hard as you can, and see what comes back the other way. You might be surprised.
Gara, it's very interesting. And Glenn, to follow up on that, you actually have been quite bold as a leader of foundations, and obviously working with a living donor, which can complicate things, needless to say. How do you feel about foundations using their voice, or foundation people, but foundation institutions actually using their voice to advocate for the things that they care about? Because again, a lot of them seem to kind of fall into the background and let the grantees do the work and not take advantage of their position in our culture.
So yes, I think foundations should use their voice. I don't think it means that foundations are under obligation to speak out on anything and everything. I think you can. I think that they should be relatively judicious about it. But if you can't speak out about authoritarianism or attacks on the very communities that you're purporting to protect, if not now, when?
Yeah, and I think we started out in early last year with the same reaction in terms of voice from the foundation sector. A great deal of fear to step in and question the administration, question the attack on DEI, question the attack on the nonprofit sector. But within about 6 months, you started to see a bit of a change. I think when Minneapolis happened, you started to see more foundations starting to question things and speaking out. So it can happen, and I think that's a great call out and call in, Gara. Thank you. All right.
Well, and also, Glenn,
Yeah.
you and I think it's important, if you spend a lot of your life mouthing off about the shortcomings of foundations, as I often do, that when you see good practice, you recognize it. So it's not perfect, but I think that it's a low bar. But I think that the foundation community coming together, and the nonprofit community more broadly, to express some solidarity in advance, and the support that some foundation leaders have shown for Open Society, which is the kind of canary in the coal mine here, is admirable, and it pleasantly surprised me, and I'd like to see more of it.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Gara, you have done a masterful job of obliterating like 20 fake rules in this episode. We haven't if there were a ticker on the side, they'd be spinning so people could see it. So let's get to the big one for you. What is the one fake rule that you would like to see foundations and philanthropy break out there?
Well, it's not necessarily the most important fake rule, but I don't even know if it's even a rule. It's a norm, but I was thinking about this. I think that foundations need to get over their mania for differentiation and for what's the right word? For putting their own stamp on things.
Mm-hmm.
Ego drives a huge amount in philanthropy, not just from the people who are wealthy themselves, but from the CEOs of these foundations, because you're evaluated by the world to some extent, but certainly by your trustees, by differentiation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that we should. I think there's too much differentiation and too much of a bias for newness and too much of a bias for credit in philanthropy. And if people, before they started a foundation or started an initiative, looked around and saw somebody who was doing it well and in which they had confidence, I think they should think about riding that wave before they create something new. So is that a rule? Is it a fake rule? I don't know. But I wish I'd done more of that myself in philanthropy, and I think people should be more humble and less ego-driven about having their own stamp and their own brand and their own name on things.
You are a busy man. We are so grateful to you for taking some time to meet with us and be on Break Fake Rules. I can't wait for a bunch more conversations on the side.
Well, thanks a lot, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you and to be in that conversation with you offline, and I really appreciate your inviting me today.